Okay, we're coming down the home stretch. We're going to start talking about managing short-term, long-term financing and some of the cash flow requirements as you look at management of the firm. So working capital management is the management of short-term assets and short-term liabilities. So your short-term financing sources. When you think about a balance sheets are ordered from most liquid to least liquid, and working capital is essentially those assets which are expected to be converted into cash or are cash, and those assets that are expected to be converted to cash within 1 year. Net working capital is an important concept, and that's calculated by taking current assets and subtracting current liabilities. And essentially, that shows the amount of current assets that are financed by short-term or by long-term liabilities, including equity. Every company needs to have a working capital policy. That policy is what your targets are going to be for each current asset account and how you're going to finance current operations or current assets. Working capital only includes current liabilities that are specifically used to finance current assets. So again, you may have working capital that is related to, that you may have current liabilities are related to payroll payable, but only those that are being utilized to finance current assets, i.e. inventory, would be considered working capital. One of the important components of managing any business is the cash conversion cycle. The cash conversion cycle is the length of time from payment for purchase for raw materials, so the time you send money out because you bought raw materials, to the collection of the accounts receivable associated with the sale of that product. So the cash conversion cycle is the inventory conversion period, the amount of time it takes from the day you send the payment out for your inventory to have that inventory turned into a saleable product, then and to have that sold. Then you've got the DSO, which is day sales outstanding, which is the receivables collection period. So once you sell something, how quickly do you get paid for it? And then you've got the DPO, the deferred payables period, and that's essentially how long can you delay making payments to your suppliers. When a business runs out of cash, it'll go bankrupt, regardless of whether it's profitable or not. And so cash management is one of the most critical and one of the most overlooked elements of managing a business. So here's a little bit of calculation on the inventory conversion period. It's the length of time that it takes to convert materials into finished goods and then sell, and the amount of time a product remains in inventory at various stages of completion. We want to have, in general, the shortest possible inventory conversion period. We want to have the shortest possible day sales outstanding period, and we want to have the longest possible deferred payment period. That's just for cash management purposes. So your inventory conversion period, you take the amount of inventory on a balance sheet divided by cost of goods per day and cost of goods sold per day. And again, that's your inventory. We generally will use in finance a 360-day convention. So that's cost of goods sold divided by 360 days on an annual set of financial statements, annual income statement. 360 days divided by cost of goods sold over inventory, or 360 days divided by inventory turnover. All these will give you the same answer, which is the inventory conversion period. The receivables collection period, DSO, day sales outstanding, is how long does it take you to receive the cash in from your business after you make a sale. So you're going to take your receivables and divide that by daily credit sales. And again, that's your receivables divided by annual credit sales over 360 days. And again, you can reduce this, so it's 360 days, and you've got annual credit sales over receivables, which is receivables turnover. So as long as you have each one of these components, you can calculate your day sales outstanding. The payables deferral period, or deferred payables obligation, is the length of time between the purchase of raw materials and labor and the payment of cash. So that's going to be your accounts payable, which is also going to include any of your salaries payable and other elements related to manufacture, divided by daily credit purchases. So that's going to be your payables divided by cost of goods sold over 360 days, assuming that your cost of goods sold is on credit. 360 days, again, you can flip-flop these around. So because of mathematical operations, you can put 360 at the top. Your cost of goods sold divided by your payables, and that'll give you your payables turnover. Essentially, you're assuming that all payables are paid on credit. The cash conversion cycle is the amount of average length of time it takes a dollar to essentially hit your bank account, and how long is it tied up in current assets. So you've got your inventory conversion period plus your days sales outstanding minus the amount of time it takes for you to make a payment out. So let's look at Unilate. We've got a model here which shows how Unilate works. You've got an inventory conversion period of 79 days. When we look at the purchase of raw materials and we pay for raw materials, that payables deferral period is only 8.8 days. So if we kind of take a look at it, 79 days for us to get inventory out the door, and then it takes 43.2 days for us to get cash in. So we're able to defer payables for 8.8 days. Cash goes out at 8.8 days. The cash conversion cycle, so essentially the amount of time it takes for us to take the inventory conversion, collect the cash, is 113 days. So essentially from the time we manufacture something, it takes us a net 113.4 days to actually get that cash in the door. So from the time we begin spending money on making the inventory and getting the raw materials to the time the cash comes in the door, it comes out to 113.4 days. In general, this is a very poor number. We'd be looking for a number that's closer to 30 to 45 days. So when we go back and think about early in the course where we talked about Unilate and how they're performing, one of their challenges is they're having a really tough time converting inventory to cash. Some of that is in receivables. This should normally be 30 days or less. Inventory conversion, 79 days is extremely long. A lot of companies have gone to just-in-time inventory, which you'll probably get in your operations classes, and that essentially tries to reduce the amount of this time as much as possible so that the inventory shows up and goes out the door immediately, and you're not tying up a bunch of money in inventory, and you want to defer your payables if you can to match your receivables. So ideally, 8.8 days is really quick. You'd like to see this closer to 30 to 45 days, just like like to see this closer to 30 to 45 days. And you'd like to see this close to zero. So current asset financing policies. How should current assets be financed? Well, permanent current assets should be financed a little differently than temporary current assets. So what are permanent current assets? Permanent current assets are the level that remains stable no matter what the seasonal or economic conditions. It's essentially the buffer that you're going to have in both inventory and cash. And then you got temporary current assets, which is a level that fluctuates with seasonal and economic conditions. And I'll give you an extreme example. Suppose you make Christmas trees, artificial Christmas trees. You're going to build inventory probably in July and August for manufacture in September to ship in October so that the inventory can be sold by retailers in November and December. And then you're not going to have much inventory January, February through July through to June or July because there's not a lot of demand for your goods. The amount of inventory that you're going to maintain during that period of time from January through June and cash and accounts receivable is your permanent current assets. The amount that you're ramping up in July and August to be ready for season is going to be your temporary current assets. And we can see that coming up. There's a few alternative current asset financing policies. The maturity matching approach, that was essentially what I just showed you with the accounts payable, accounts receivable on Unilate, where I said, ideally you're trying to match your payment out with your cash in, and you're trying to essentially match the maturity, match the cash flow timing. You've got a conservative approach, which is holding additional cash, an additional buffer, and then you've got an aggressive approach, which is essentially maintaining a lower level of permanent current assets and dipping into those when you're running slow. We talked a little bit about maturity matching and self-liquidating because the idea is you match liabilities maturities with the asset maturities. So, your accounts payable is paid when the accounts receivable is collected, and that timing is synced up. If maturities can be matched, firm use this approach should not have any difficulty paying maturing obligations. And some assets' lives are uncertain. So some of the assets around inventory and accounts receivable are going to be uncertain. So it's going to be sometimes difficult to time that. And it's considered a moderate or mid-level current asset financing approach. And here it is graphically. You can see that you have a set of total permanent assets for the business. You've got fixed assets rising over time, and that's going to be essentially financed by long-term debt and equity and some spontaneous current liabilities, some current liabilities like payables. Then you've got a permanent level of current assets, and that permanent level of current assets is what you're going to maintain on a regular basis. So as the company's growing, fixed assets grow, you may have to grow additional inventory or accounts receivable. And at short-term non-spontaneous debt financing, so essentially that's planned debt, that may be commercial paper, that may be short-term bonds, that may be overnight repurchase agreements. And then you've got this temporary level of current assets going up and down based upon the business activity. And that's going to be essentially financed separately with, and you're going to need to account for some of that in your debt financing. If you use a conservative approach, you're going to use permanent capital to finance all your permanent assets and some seasonal temporary needs. And you're going to use spontaneous short-term debt, so payables, predominantly to finance the rest of the temporary assets, your seasonal needs. You're going to store liquidity. You're going to maintain a significant amount of cash during the off season. It's the least profitable, but it's also the least risky approach to managing current assets. So here it is graphically. You've got your fixed assets, which we had noted before. You've got your permanent level of current assets. This is all financed with long-term debt, including part of this seasonal piece. So you can see before we financed this part with long-term debt through here, and then we use spontaneous assets essentially to finance this variation. In a conservative approach, we're actually going to take on more long-term debt. We're going to hold more cash. We're going to finance more of this temporary current asset difference. So at some periods of time right here, we're going to actually have excess cash, which in this particular case, the company would be investing in marketable securities. So things like money market funds or overnight repurchase agreements to get some interest on it because you're paying interest on it here. And then you're going to use payables and basically short-term financing for this element here, where you're going to have a shortage between your permanent financing and your temporary financing. You've got an aggressive approach. An aggressive approach would be you finance all temporary current assets with short-term spontaneous debt, finance all fixed assets with some permanent current assets, and some permanent current assets with long-term non-spontaneous funds. It's the riskiest and it's the most profitable because you're only taking on debt when you really need it, and to the extent that you're able to use payables and other debt that doesn't charge interest, it will improve your profitability. So when we look at this graphically, you can see that our permanent financing goes to this level. You're always going to have some of the short-term debt financing in place that's going to actually take you up to your permanent level of current assets. Plus, you're going to take on additional short-term borrowing to cover your seasonal fluctuation. Now, if the company starts going bad or has significant issues with liquidity, this short-term financing might be cut off for you because you're getting underwritten every time you go back for additional money, whether that's credit cards or whether that's overnight bank loans or short-term bank loans or whether that's payables. This can get cut off. So this is riskier, but generally the interest rate on this short-term debt is significantly lower than it would be on long-term fixed debt, and certainly lower than equity, which we saw in the last couple of chapters. So this is going to be the riskiest because you're having to go back and get additional debt every time you're kind of running short and you're going to need that at a significant level, but your cost of that debt is going to be low or lower than equity. So when we look at short-term financing, maturity on short-term debt is generally defined as a liability scheduled for repayment within 1 year. A short-term loan can be obtained much faster than long-term credit, including things like credit cards. And companies use credit cards on a regular basis. The company I'm running now, we have a $250,000 line on our credit card. We utilize it to purchase almost everything every month, and then we pay it off within the next 30 days, get no interest, get a rebate. It works well from a cash flow perspective. However, the bank could always shut that card down or freeze our card, and then at that point we'd have an issue. So there's some risk associated with it. The cost short-term debt is generally less expensive. The interest rate is lower than long-term debt, and short-term debt is considered riskier than long-term debt from the perspective of the company because, as I just mentioned, it can be non-issued at any time or non-renewed at any time by the bank. There's some sources of short-term financing. So those sources are going to include accruals. So that's continually recurring short-term liabilities like payroll. So liabilities such as wages, taxes that increase with operations. Those generally you have anywhere from a week to a month to pay them, and so you can use that float. You've got accounts payable, so trade credit. You get in 1,000 widgets, and the terms are 210 net 30. So you have a 2% discount if you pay within 10 days, and it's due within 30 days. So you basically have a 30-day interest-free loan on accounts payable, and that's when someone buys on credit from another firm. Conversely, when someone buys on credit from you, they owe you accounts receivable. You're generally not getting interest on that. Normally, the term is going to be 30 days. And so you're also a lender, which is why you want to generally time the cash receipts and the accounts payable up so that way you're a net zero borrower or lender. And if you could be a net positive borrower, that's even better. There's some other short-term bank loans, so maturity of 90 days or less, revolving lines of credit, credit cards, etc. are forms of this. We'll talk a little bit about some other alternatives as well. You've got promissory notes, which are essentially firm fixed notes. So you may say, I got a promissory note for $10,000. It's due in 90 days, paid back with interest. So you may have to pay back $10,250 in 90 days. And that's going to be generally collateralized by the accounts receivable. So you're financing your accounts receivable with your promissory note. Normally, a short-term bank loan will require a compensating balance of 10 to 20% of the loan amount to be maintained in the checking account so that if you don't collect all the accounts receivable, there's still cash available to make a complete and full repayment. You can also have a line of credit. Line of credits specify the amount of funds that are available, and generally they revolve. And a revolving line of credit is just like a credit card. You have a amount that the bank gives you for a line of credit. Let's say it's $1 million. You can draw against it, and then you can have your cash and pay it down just like you do your credit card. You have a limit, and then you essentially what they call revolve against it. You pay it down as you get cash in. You draw against it as you need cash. And we'll talk a little bit about zero balance accounts, but essentially a revolving line of credit is often linked to a ZBA, a zero balance account, which essentially allows you to manage your cash most efficiently. A lot of times you got a commitment fee on a line of credit, so the bank may charge 1% commitment fee when they underwrite that line of credit and recharge that every year. So if you have a $2 million line of credit, they may charge you $20,000 a year just to maintain that line of credit. It's similar to the old annual fees for credit cards. And that's how the bank gets paid if you don't utilize the line of credit. And that's also, they have to reserve essentially and have money available for you to be able to draw on when you need to draw on the line of credit. And so part of that is having a commitment fee to compensate them for that funds availability. Bigger companies can use commercial paper. Commercial paper is unsecured short-term promissory notes issued by large financially sound firms. They're traded in the They're traded actively in Chicago and New York, and a lot of companies, mutual funds, will utilize commercial paper as the primary asset within money market funds. These are a discounted financial instruments, so they're purchased at less than face value. So you may Say I'm going to borrow something for 270 days and it's $10 million. You might receive $9,900,000, and then you get that extra, so that's what you pay for it. And then when the company pays you back, they pay you back $10 million. So that would be, about a 14% interest rate. That's the commercial paper market in a nutshell. The maturity is normally 270 days or less. Sometimes it's shorter than, it's 1 to 30 days is common. And the biggest thing with commercial paper is these are going to be large companies that are financially sound and extremely liquid. You also have secured loans. Some of these are going to be inventory loans or accounts receivable loans. They're generally secured by short-term assets, especially accounts receivable and inventory. The loan is not for 100% of the asset's value. So if you have $100,000 of inventory, the bank may loan you 60% of that. And if you have a $150,000 of accounts receivable, they may lend you 80% of that. So the accounts receivable financing, you have to pledge accounts receivable. So that's essentially you use it as collateral for the loan, and that would be the example I just gave, where you got $150,000 accounts receivable. The bank will lend you up to 80% of it, and a lot of times the bank will then collect that money directly, as opposed to you having to send them a check. The other thing you could do is factor your accounts receivable, which is you sell the accounts receivable to another company to collect, and you get a cash advance on those. This could be recourse or non-recourse. If it's non-recourse, if the factor doesn't collect, you don't have to pay. For recourse, if the factor doesn't collect, you may have to pay the amount that was advanced back. Inventory financing, talked about this just briefly a minute ago. There's generally going to be a blanket lien against all inventory, and that's going to be low price, fast moving inventory. So if you have a toy store and you have a bunch of Monopoly games, for instance, they're going to have a blanket lien, and that blanket lien is going to be filed with the Secretary of State on what's called a UCC1, and they're going to file that, and then essentially if anything goes wrong with your company, they have a lien against all the inventory that's sitting there, and they are secured by that. You've also got a trust receipt. So trust receipt is oftentimes utilized when you've got specific identification numbers, so inventory serial numbers, whether that's automobiles or computers or other high-ticket items. And those are going to be, you're essentially borrowed against that specific piece of inventory, and as that inventory is sold, the amount is repaid from the lender or to the lender, and the lender releases the inventory. And then you've got a warehouse receipt, which is if you've got, going back to the toy store, you have a bunch of Monopoly games and you financed half the Monopoly games. The half that are financed with a warehouse receipt are segregated from the half that you paid cash for, essentially, and the bank controls those, or has the ability to control those in the event you don't repay. When we're taking a look at the cost of short-term credit, we have to compute the cost of using the funds for a given period, so that, again, we're going back to what's the required rate of return and what's the risk, and how does this look? It's the same principles that we see over and over and over again. So in this particular case, we've got the required rate of return is the cost of borrowing over the period of the cost of borrowing divided by the amount of usable funds. Essentially, this is going to include things like, when you talk cost of borrowing, and we talked about commitment fees, you're going to add in not only the interest, but you're going to add in commitment fees and other fees associated with the cost of borrowing those amounts of money, and then you're going to put it over the amount of the usable funds available, and what you've been able to access. The effective interest rate and annual percentage rate, using our period, you're going to have the effective interest rate is going to be 1 plus the required rate of return over to the number of borrowing periods in a year minus 1. And the APR, annual percentage rate, is going to be essentially the rate for the period times the number of borrowing rate or number of borrowing periods. So here's an example. We'll walk through it. Suppose a firm buys on credit from its supplier with terms of 2.5, 10 net 45. So this is, you get a 2.5% discount if you pay within 10 days. Otherwise, the full amount is due in 45 days. If the firm purchases products with an invoice price of 100, its effective price is $97.50 because it receives a $2.50 discount for paying on day 10 of the billing cycle. So that's what that 2.5 net 10 or 2.510 net 45 means. If the firm pays at day 45, it would pay $2.50 in interest on a 35-day loan in the amount of $97.50, because what you're essentially doing here is your real cost of the inventory is $97.50. What your supplier is saying is, we're going to charge you, if you think about this in a little different way, we're going to charge you 2.5% interest if you want to use the full 45 days. Otherwise, you pay $97.50. So in this particular case, we take a look at the trade credit, and where generally folks would look at this as a discount, it's really baked into the price. And so we look at it from a finance perspective as interest that we would need to pay to take on that 35-day loan. So is paying $2.50 in interest on a 35-day loan a good idea? Well, let's take a look. Suppose a firm buys on credit from its supplier with terms of 2.510 net 45. So the return on the period is, you've got 2.5% over 1 over minus 2.5%, so 2.5 over 0.975. So you got 0.025641 or 256 per 30-day period. So again, this was per 30-day period that we're looking at here. The annual percentage rate on that is 256 times 360 over 30, so over 12 times 12. 2.56% times 12 is 30.72%. And so we're looking at this going, do we really want to pay 30.72% annual percentage rate for that loan? Probably not. The effective annual rate of interest is equal to 1 plus the periodic rate over or taken to the 12th power, and so minus 1. So if we do that, the effective annual rate is 35.44%. Again, this will show you that when someone gives you 210 net 30 or 2.5 net 10, you are getting a pretty good deal if you pay that early. And if you wait till that 45-day point, they're charging you effectively 35% interest for that. Same thing with when you're issuing credit, you want to make sure, it's sometimes difficult to collect interest. So if you say, hey, if you don't pay, your interest is going to be, payable at 1% or 2% per month. But if you go, we're going to give you a discount, psychologically, we're going to mark up the price and you go, we're going to give you a discount of 2% if you pay within 10 days. But, and the full amount is due in 45 days, you're earning an additional 35% if you had just marked up that price by 2 to 3% on the money and then went back and issued a discount against it. When we look at the cost of short-term credit for a bank loan, here's an example, again, utilizing the same formulas. You suppose a firm borrows $50,000 at 9% for 3 months, which is 90 days, and both the principal and interest are paid at maturity. So there's no periodic payments, but at the 90-day point, you're going to pay back the full amount. So what does that look like? Well, you've got your return per period, which is $50,000 times 9% annual interest for 3 months, which is 1,025 over 50,000. So when we do that math, because this is the principal amount, when we do that math, we come out to 2.25% is the 3-month interest rate. So we're going to pay $1,125 over 3 months. In order to figure out what that is on a annual percentage rate basis, you take the 2.25% and multiply by 4, 12 months divided by 3. That gives you 9. Shocker, that's the same number. The effective interest rate. Because you've got elements of compounding, you've got 2.25, 12 to the fourth minus 1. That gives you 0.931. So your effective annual rate is 9.31% on that short-term bank loan. Suppose a firm borrows $50,000, 9% for 3 months, discount interest loan, so the interest is paid up front. So what happens if you essentially, instead of borrowing $50,000, you borrow $48,875 and you pay that $1125 up front? So the bank only gives you $48,875. Well, in that particular case, it looks like this, where you've got the amount that's paid, $50,000 times 9% over times 1/4 of the year, over $50,000 minus the amount that is paid in interest. So $50,000 times 0.9 over a quarter, or times a quarter, equals $48,875. So that's 2.3. So 2.3% is your 3-month interest rate. Your annual percentage rate then is 9.2, 2.3 times 4, not 9%. So you can see the difference between paying interest up front and paying interest at the end is 20 basis points. And then the effective annual rate, you go through the same calculation as you did before, and it's 9.52%. Essentially, you've got your 1 plus 2.3% to the fourth power minus 1 gives you 9.52%. So in an installment loan, kind of the similar structure, except an installment loan, interest is added on and the interest is paid back in equal installments along with the principal repayment. This is typical of car loans and home loans and student loans. And so your payments are all the same, and a portion of it goes to principal, a portion of it goes to interest. So what does that look like? Suppose a firm borrows $50,000, 9% for 3 months and 90 days. So again, we've got $1,125 worth of interest. The principal paid each month, $50,000 divided by 3, so we're paying $16,666.67 per month. The average loan balance is $333.33 because, again, you've got month 0, month 3 divided by 2, so that's your average outstanding balance. The annual percentage rate based upon the average outstanding balance is actually 13.5%. So if you're paying $1125, when you look back here, you're paying that $1125, you're paying it at the beginning, that's costing you 9.2. When you pay it at the end, it costs you 9. But when you start paying down, but you've got the amount of principal outstanding the entire time, when you start paying the principal down and it's not decreasing the amount of interest that's due, so the amount of interest was calculated essentially as a flat amount, $1125, but you're paying the principal down over 3 months, your effective annual interest rate is significantly higher. Your annual percentage rate is 13.5 because the first month you have $50,000 out. The next month you only have $333.33. The next month you have $16,667.67, and then you're at 0. But you've paid interest as if that $50,000 was outstanding the entire time. If we look at it from a commercial paper perspective, suppose a firm issues 3-month commercial paper with a $50,000 face value, 9% interest. Transaction fees are 5% of the issue amount. Discount the instrument. So we've got that same 9% interest rate. So we got $1125 that we need to pay in interest. That's a discount. It's going to look very similar to the interest deducted up front that we saw in the last analysis. Plus, you've got transaction fees of 50 basis points, 5.5%. So that's $250 on $50,000. So what does that look like? Well, the actual rate for the period is going to be $1125, which is the interest plus the flotation costs or plus the commitment costs or the commitment fee or what have you. Remember, I had mentioned that before. You're going to divide that by the amount of money you actually receive, which is the $50,000 minus the interest, minus the interest that was not paid. So essentially the discount amount plus the amount of fees that you had to pay. So you've got $13.75 that you paid out for financing costs over $48,625, which is the amount of cash you actually got at the beginning, which gets you 0.0283, 2.83% is your interest rate. That's your 3-month. So you multiply that by 4, again 12 over 3, and that is going to give you 11.32% APR. The effective annual rate, again, when you go through that calculation, is going to give you a little bit higher, 11.81%. So suppose the firm needs $50,000 to support operations. The firm plans on raising the funds by borrowing from the bank. The loan would be for 3 months. Its interest rate 9%, and a 20% compensating balance is required. The firm has no money in the bank. So to use the $50,000, the firm's got to borrow more than $50,000 because it's got to have $10,000 compensating balance sitting in the bank, or a little bit more than $10,000 compensating balance because it's compensating balance on the full amount of the loan. And so how much money does a firm need to borrow in order to have $50,000 available when it's got to set a portion of that, the amount of money aside that it can't use as a compensating balance? So we'll walk through that calculation as well. So firm needs $50,000, interest 9%, compensating balance is 20% of the amount borrowed. So the usable funds, this is a base calculation, usable funds, $50,000 is the amount that we need to use. And we're going to put that over 1 minus the reduction from the principal amount associated with the compensating balance, so 1 minus 20%. So that gets us $62,500. If the firm borrows $62,500, the compensating balance requirement will be $12,500, which is $62,500 times 20%. The amount of funds the firm will be able to use is $50,000, which is the amount that they borrowed minus the amount that's sitting in compensating balance. So this also impacts your effective interest rate. So the firm needed $50,000, interest is a 9%, compensating balance requirement is 20% of the amount borrowed. So we ended up borrowing $62,500 in this case. So our interest that is due is $1,406.25, but we can only utilize the $50,000 available. That other $12,500 is sitting in a compensating balance account. So the interest is paid on $62,500. The amount that we have available for use is $50,000. So that gives us 2.81% periodic rate for 3 months. So when we divide that by, or multiply that by 4 for an annual percentage rate, we get 11.24%. And when we look at this on an effective annual rate, we get 11.72%. So let me just take a couple steps back and give you a couple practical pieces of advice. When you're borrowing money from a bank, you can see every one of these examples was 9% interest. 9% interest. None of these, with the exception of one, was effective annual percentage rate or effective annual rate at 9% interest. The interest ranged all the way up into the 11s. And so be very careful when you get quoted, whether it's a home loan, student loan, car loan, credit card, when you get quoted a rate, be very careful, and generally the law requires them to disclose to you the annual percentage rate and the effective annual rate. Take a look at these. Don't just pay attention to this 9%. This 9%, you saw it was 9% on every one of these examples, and yet the effective annual rate is in the 11s on this particular example. So be very careful, be sophisticated as a borrower, understand what your real interest rate is as opposed to what the stated rate of interest is, and know how to calculate that. Again, they're in most cases, particularly on consumer loans, they're required to disclose it, but look for that because it could surprise you based upon the repayment terms, how much that interest rate really changes because it's got hidden fees or it's got things like compensating balances. The other thing to keep in mind is remember how much value there is associated with paying a discount early. That was a 30-some% effective interest rate if you paid the payable early, and how much value there is to putting a discount on and increasing your price a little bit and building your financing costs into your price and providing a discount for more rapid payment by your customers because you can earn quite a bit of additional profit associated with financing their receivables. And don't let them finance their receivables without paying you. couple items we'll touch on briefly as we do at the end of most chapters with international and multinational businesses. The U.S. is a little different than most European firms when it comes to working capital management. The average cash conversion cycle of European firms is more than twice that of U.S. firms. U.S. firms have gotten very good at inventory management as well as cash flow management. The European firms less so. Additionally, we have a tendency to be able to collect credit and collect it quicker. However, U.S. firms, because the cash conversion cycle is quicker, we're also able to, the European firms will follow a more aggressive working capital policy because the cash conversion cycle is longer, and so they need to get their profits up. So they tend to have a more aggressive working capital policy. So they'll have less of their working capital underpinned with equity and long-term debt, more of it floating in terms of accounts payable and accounts receivable, and some of the spontaneous working capital requirements.